In the fall of 1989, a drought hit northern Israel, hard enough to shrink the Sea of Galilee. The water pulled back from the shoreline, farther than anyone living had seen it go. And when it did, something appeared in the mud that had no business being there. Burned huts, fireplaces, the floor of an ancient camp, sealed under the lake for ages. Archaeologists ran the dates. The camp was 23,000 years old. Then they started counting what was inside it. And the counting took years, because the ash of those huts held roughly 150,000 seeds and fruits. Wild wheat was in there. Wild barley, too. A flat stone from one of the huts still carried starch in its cracks, because somebody had knelt on that floor and ground grain into flour. Nearby lay small stone blades with a telltale gloss along the edge. The kind of shine a blade only picks up from sawing through the silica in cereal stalks. Sickles. In other words, here is the problem with all of that. Every textbook will tell you farming began about 12,000 years ago. This camp is 11,000 years older than that. The gap between these people and the first farmers is almost as wide as the gap between the first farmers and you. So what were they? They harvested grain. They milled flour beside their own homes. And archaeologists will tell you, flatly, that they were not farmers. Which means the question this video asks sounds simple and is anything but. At what point does gathering food become growing it? Because somewhere between that drowned camp and your breakfast, a line got crossed. Finding that line is the whole story. The drowned camp has a name. Ohalo, too. And the more the excavators learned about it, the stranger it became. Start with the huts themselves. There were at least 6 of them, built of brushwood. Tamarisk and oak branches bent and bundled into shelters, with floors of packed grass. People swept those floors. They lost things in the corners. Beads, flint chips, fishing weights. And around the hearths outside they left the bones of their meals. And the bones are what give their secret away. Among them are birds that only pass through the Galilee in winter, and other birds that only appear in summer. The fruits in the ash ripen in different seasons too. Line all of it up, and one conclusion gets hard to avoid. Nobody was drifting through this camp. People were living at this lakeshore most of the year. Maybe all of it. In something dangerously close to a village. 10,000 years before villages were supposed to exist. Now watch what a day there looked like. Somebody walks out to a stand of wild wheat with a stone sickle. Somebody hauls the harvest back in baskets. And somebody, we know exactly where, kneels at that flat grinding slab inside the third hut and works the grain into flour. Hour after hour. Because grinding grain by hand is brutally slow work. Zoom out and squint, and you are looking at a farm. A harvest coming in from the fields. Flour being milled beside the house. Except nothing here was planted. Every stalk those sickles cut was wild. Or was it because in that mountain of seeds, botanists noticed something that still starts arguments today? Mixed in with the wheat and barley were the seeds of certain scrappy little plants, the kind researchers call proto-weeds. These are nature's opportunists. They thrive in one very particular setting. Soil that people have disturbed, cleared and broken and messed with. Some of the scientists who studied Ohalo 2 think those weeds are a fingerprint. Oh, a hint that these people were experimenting. Actually putting seed into worked ground. 11,000 years ahead of schedule. Other researchers push back hard, and the debate is genuinely unsettled. Hold that uncertainty for a moment, because it matters. Even the experts, staring at the same seeds, cannot always tell where gathering ends. And it gets better. Move forward in time about 9,000 years to a windswept site in northeastern Jordan called Shubaika. People there built round stone huts with fireplaces sunk into the floors. And inside one of those fireplaces, sifted out of the ash, researchers found small charred crumbs that took 2 years to identify. The verdict, when it came, was bread. 14,400 years old. Someone had gathered wild grain, ground it, mixed the flour with water, worked in the mashed root of a wetland plant, and baked flat loaves on the hot stones. That is the oldest bread anyone has found so far. And it is at least 2,000 years older than farming. Sit with the order of events there. Because we all learned it backwards. Humans did not invent farming and then figure out bread. Bread came first. People loved a food so much that they were sinking enormous labor into it while it still grew wild. Some researchers think that craving for bread, and maybe for beer as well, is part of what eventually pushed people to want far more grain than the wild hills could give them. So take inventory of the world before agriculture. Sickles. Check. Grinding stones. Check. Year-round homes standing next to wild grain fields. Check. Bread baking in the fire. Check. Every single piece of the farming picture is already sitting there, sometimes for thousands of years. Except one. These people took whatever the land decided to grow. What they had never done was make that decision themselves. The oldest clear evidence of somebody making it comes from a low mound of earth a few hundred miles to the northeast, on the banks of the Euphrates River. Archaeologists got 2 seasons to dig it before the water came. In the early 1970s, Syria was building the Tabqa Dam, and the dam was going to turn a long stretch of the Euphrates Valley into a lake. Everything in that valley was about to disappear, including a broad, unremarkable-looking mound that locals called Abu Huraira. A British team led by archaeologist Andrew Moore got there ahead of the water, with barely 2 seasons to work. What they pulled out of that mound before it drowned turned out to be one of the most important records of the human past ever recovered. Abu Huraira was a place people lived across thousands of years, through the exact stretch of time when this video's question gets answered. And because each generation built on top of the last one's trash and floors and fallen walls, the mound rose layer by layer, with time stacked inside it in order. The deepest layers are the oldest. Read it from the bottom up, and the mound works like a diary that nobody meant to keep. Today, it sits at the bottom of Lake Assad. Everything we know is what Moore's team carried out in those 2 seasons, including hundreds of bags of charred seeds. The diary opens around 13,000 years ago, and the opening entries describe a good life. The village sat where several worlds met: river, floodplain, steppe and open woodland, and the people living in its pit houses were gatherers of staggering skill. The seed bags from these layers hold well over 100 different wild plants that people were collecting for food. Wild einkorn, wheat, and rye from the woodland edge. Lentils, fruit, seeds from the feather grasses of the steppe, gathered by the basket load. And every year, the Persian gazelle came through on migration in herds thousands strong. And for a few weeks, the village killed and dried enough meat to matter for months. Nobody here was scraping by. This was abundance. The hunter-gatherer life running at its absolute peak. Then the diary records a disaster, and the seeds tell it better than any writing could. About 12,900 years ago, the planet lurched. After ages of slow warming, the climate of the whole region snapped back toward Ice Age conditions, cold and dry, within a lifetime or 2. The event has a technical name: the Younger Dryas. and that is all the meteorology you need. What matters is what it did to the land around one village on the Euphrates. In the layers from these years, the wild foods start disappearing, and they vanish in sequence, like someone walking through a market at closing time, shutting down one stall after another. First, the fruits and seeds from the warmth-loving trees thin out and drop away, as the woodland dies back and retreats upriver, farther from the village every decade. Then some of the drought-sensitive wild grains fade. Layer by layer, the menu that had supported the good life gets shorter. The people of Abu Huraira were watching their supermarket close, aisle by aisle. Over the course of a few generations, they had options, and the old option, the one their ancestors had always used, was to move, follow the retreating woodland, chase the food. But leaving meant abandoning the river, the Gazel migration, the stored grain, the houses, everything the village was. So, somewhere in those cold decades, somebody at Abu Huraira tried the other option, the one with no precedent behind it. In layers dating to around 13,000 years ago, seeds of rye appear in quantities that make no sense, right as the wild stands of it were dying out of reach of the village. Some of those grains are plumper than their wild cousins. Alongside them come seeds of exactly the scrappy field weeds you met at Ohallo too, the ones that follow broken soil around. To the excavators who first pieced this sequence together, the reading was as stunning as it was simple. The wild rye was leaving, and instead of letting it go, someone had held back a handful of seed and pressed it into the ground near the village. When the plant you depend on stops growing where you live, you can follow it, or you can keep it. They kept it. To be straight with you, the dating of those particular rye grains has been argued over ever since, the way every early claim in this field gets argued over. And Abu Huraira is one witness, backed up by other sites across Southwest Asia, telling a similar story on a similar clock. But the sequence in that mound draws the line this whole video has been hunting for. Below a certain layer, people took what the land grew on its own. Above it, people had started deciding what would grow next. Nobody down in that layer thought of it as inventing anything. It was a survival trick bolted onto a gatherer's life. One more skill next to hunting gazelle and pounding roots. Which leaves one gigantic problem. A planted rye seed looks almost identical to a gathered one. The people who did this left no writing, no new tool, no monument to mark the year the first seed went into the ground. So, how can anyone dig up a charred grain 13,000 years later and claim to know it was farmed? The answer is not in the dirt. It is in the plant itself. Because while people were changing how they got their food, the grain in their hands had quietly started changing too. And it kept a record of everything. To see how a seed can testify, you have to get close to a stalk of wild wheat. Closer than most people ever bother to look. Run your eye up the stem to the head, where the grains sit stacked in two neat rows. Each grain is attached to the stalk by a tiny joint, a connector about the size of this sentence's period. And that joint is the most important piece of engineering in this entire story. Botanists call the whole spine of the seed head the rachis. In wild wheat and wild barley and wild rye, that joint is built to fail. It is brittle on purpose. The moment the grain ripens, the joint shatters at the slightest touch. A gust of wind, a passing animal, anything, and the seeds scatter to the ground. From the plant's point of view, this is the entire meaning of existence. A wild grass has one job: get your seeds off the stalk and into the soil. And a seed that falls is a seed that gets to become next year's plant. Every so often, in any wild stand, a mutation shows up. A plant sprouts with joints that hold. Its grains ripen and just hang there, waiting. And the plant stands in the field, fully loaded, while its neighbors shed everything they have. In the wild, that mutant is a dead end. Its seeds never reach the ground, so it leaves no descendants. And the mutation vanishes. It had been appearing and vanishing like that, over and over, for millions of years. A losing lottery ticket printed fresh every generation. Then people showed up with sickles, and the lottery flipped. Picture the harvest at a village like Abu Huraira, some cold spring around 13,000 years ago. A woman works her way through a stand of rye with a flint-bladed sickle, grabbing and cutting. And she has no idea she is running an experiment. The ordinary plants around her have been dropping ripe grain for days. A good share of their seed is already on the ground, out of her reach, doing what wild seed does. But scattered through the stand are the mutants, the holders, still carrying every grain they grew. When her blade comes through, whose seeds fill her basket, the holder's seeds, disproportionately, automatically, every single time. Now follow that basket home. Some of it gets ground into flour and eaten, and some of it gets held back and pressed into the soil next season as seed, which means the next generation of plants near the village grows disproportionately from holders. Nobody chose them. Nobody could have. Because you cannot see a genetic difference in a pile of grain the sickle chose. The simple act of harvesting ripe grain and replanting from the harvest quietly favored the one plant in the field that refused to let go. One season of that changes almost nothing. The shift is a rounding error. But this was every season. In some places for 100 generations of people and more. And the arithmetic never stopped grinding in the same direction. Somewhere in that long, slow slide, these plants crossed a line of their own. A field of them could no longer reseed itself. Drop a handful of this new grain in the wilderness and it would grow once, hold its seeds, and die standing there, still holding them. The plant now needed a human hand to survive, exactly as much as the humans needed the plant. And people were reshaping this species for centuries before anyone could have known it was happening. Which brings us back to the question Chapter 2 left hanging. How do archaeologists look at a charred seed and know whether it was gathered or farmed? Because the plant wrote it down. When a wild grain pops off its brittle joint naturally, it leaves a smooth, clean scar at the point of attachment. When a human threshes grain off a tough, holding stalk, the joint does not pop. It tears. And the tear leaves a rough, jagged scar. Those scars survive burning. They survive 13,000 years in the ground. Put the charred piece of stalk that once held the grain under a microscope, and it tells you exactly how that grain left the plant. Smooth for wild. Torn for the new kind of plant. The kind that exists because of people. And this is where a mound like Abu Huraira becomes priceless. Because you can read thousands of those pieces, layer by layer, bottom to top, and count. Down low, virtually every scar is smooth, wild grain. Gathered, higher up, the torn scars appear. A few percent. Then more. Then more. The holders taking over the fields in slow motion. Across the sites of Southwest Asia. That takeover took thousands of years to complete, which is a stunning thing to realize. Farming was a process so gradual that the people inside it never saw it move. The grains grow slightly larger through those same layers too. plumper generation by generation, because a planter's hand also quietly favors big seeds. Two signatures, size and scar, written into the food itself. The people left no calendar and no confession. The wheat kept the record for them. And once you can read that record, you can line up every witness in this story and answer the question we started with. Lay the whole timeline on the table. Every site you now know how to read. 23,000 years ago. The people of Ohalo II were harvesting wild grain with sickles and grinding flour beside their huts. And, whatever their disputed weeds mean, their world stayed a gathered world. 14,400 years ago, the people of Shubaika were pulling bread off the hot stones of their fireplaces, baked entirely from wild plants. Around 13,000 years ago, in the cold grip of the Younger Dryas, people at Abu Huraira and at other villages across Southwest Asia began putting seed into the ground on purpose, deciding for the first time what would grow next. And by around 10,500 years ago, the grain itself had changed. Torn scars, plump seeds, fields full of plants that could no longer live without people. That is where the argument ends for good. Past that point, the record shows domesticated crops and the people tending them. And there is no other honest word for those people than farmers. Notice what that timeline refuses to give you. There is no birthday in it. Each date marks a stage of something already in motion, and the stages bleed into each other across thousands of years. But the title of this video asks when, and you have earned a real answer. So here it is. If you have to plant a flag anywhere, plant it around 12,000 years ago in Southwest Asia. Give or take the centuries on either side where cultivation was taking hold. That is when human behavior crossed the line that matters. The shift from harvesting whatever grew to growing what you harvest. And there is one honest catch attached. The people who crossed that line had no idea a line was there. The first farmer in history did not know she was a farmer. She was a gatherer, using a clever trick to keep a dying plant close to home. And her grandchildren used the trick a little more. And there's a little more. Until nobody could remember living any other way. There is one more twist. And it might be the strangest fact in this entire story. Everything so far happened in one corner of one continent. But wheat and rye were only one version of the experiment. In the river valleys of China, people worked out the same trick with entirely different plants. Rice in the south, millet in the north, on their own clock, and with no word from the west. In the highlands of New Guinea, people were cultivating bananas and taro. And in what is now Mexico, people took on the hardest project of all, a scraggly wild grass called teosinte, whose cob is smaller than your little finger and carries about a dozen kernels armored in shells hard enough to crack teeth. Generations of selection turned that unpromising grass into corn. One of the greatest feats of plant breeding ever pulled off by anyone. Separate continents, separate crops, separate peoples who never met and never could have, each arriving at the same solution on its own clock, within a few thousand years of each other. After 200,000 years, in which no human being anywhere had ever farmed a thing, that timing is the real answer hiding under this whole question. It was never about intelligence. The people of Ohalo II were every bit as sharp as any farmer who came after them. And they proved it with their sickles and their flour. 11,000 years early. What their world would not give them was stability. Through the deep ice age, climate swung violently. Drought to frost and back. Sometimes within single lifetimes. and no one can commit to a field that might be dust before harvest. Once the Ice Age finally released its grip and the world settled into a long, warm stretch, people on 4 separate continents, each in their own time, started planting it. So, when did ancient humans begin practicing agriculture? Around 12,000 years ago. But the people beside the Sea of Galilee, kneeling at their grinding stones 23,000 years ago, were already standing at the head of that road. They just could not see where it went. The first farmers never experienced a beginning at all. They gathered, they planted, they harvested. And season by season, they changed the plants around them without knowing it. By the time agriculture was undeniably real, written in torn scars and swollen grains across the villages of Southwest Asia, the experiment had already been running for thousands of years.